There exists a particular and profound historical irony, an irony that emerges when substances of extraordinary psychoactive power become integrated into the medical and commercial systems of a civilization. When powerful addictive drugs are distributed openly and enthusiastically by the very institutions charged with protecting public health, when an entire generation of women becomes chemically dependent through mechanisms that are simultaneously legal, medically sanctioned, and socially celebrated. This is the story of how Victorian America, a civilization that prided itself on moral propriety and scientific advancement, systematically poisoned millions of women with cocaine-laced medicines while celebrating the achievement as medical progress. How the respectable institutions of medicine, commerce, and society conspired, not through malice, but through the collision of profit motive with genuine ignorance, to create one of history's largest unintended addiction epidemics. The cocaine crisis of Victorian America was not the result of criminal enterprise or social degeneracy, but rather emerged directly from the intersection of legitimate pharmaceutical innovation, aggressive commercial marketing, profound medical ignorance regarding addiction and neurochemistry, and a social system that positioned women as inherently fragile beings requiring chemical stabilization to function acceptably in society. The historical context from which this pharmaceutical transformation emerged is essential for understanding how such a catastrophic phenomenon could develop without generating immediate recognition of its nature. The 19th century was an era of extraordinary scientific advancement, a period during which chemistry was emerging as a dominant scientific discipline, a time when the systematic study of natural substances and their properties was yielding compounds of remarkable potency and remarkable utility. The isolation of morphine from opium in 1804, the extraction of quinine from cinchona bark for treating malaria, the identification and purification of various alkaloids and active compounds from plants. These represented genuine achievements in pharmaceutical science that had demonstrable benefits for human health and human welfare. The medical establishment of the 19th century, operating from this context of legitimate scientific advancement and genuine therapeutic success, approached all newly isolated compounds with a kind of cautious optimism that they might represent solutions to previously untreatable conditions. Into this landscape of pharmaceutical excitement and medical hope came cocaine, a substance isolated from coca leaves in 1859, a compound of extraordinary neurological power, a substance that produced intense euphoria and energy in those who consumed it, a drug that seemed to offer possibilities for treating pain, for managing depression, for enhancing productivity, for addressing the various physical and emotional ailments that plagued Victorian society. The initial medical response to cocaine was enthusiastic and was based on genuine observation of therapeutic effects. Cocaine was a genuinely effective local anesthetic, a property that made it valuable for surgical procedures and for dental work. Cocaine was observed to elevate mood, to produce energy, to enhance alertness and focus, properties that suggested it might be beneficial for treating depression and various forms of mental exhaustion. The medical establishment's embrace of cocaine was not based on fraudulent claims or deliberate deception, but rather on authentic observation of the compound's psychoactive effects, combined with a profound failure to understand the addictive properties that would make cocaine one of the most dangerous substances ever synthesized. The social context in which cocaine found such rapid acceptance in Victorian society was intimately connected to the particular anxieties and expectations that characterized Victorian civilization regarding gender, emotion, productivity, and mental health. Victorian society maintained extraordinarily rigid standards regarding appropriate female behavior, standards that demanded women be emotionally composed, physically beautiful according to extremely narrow parameters, perpetually available for domestic and social obligations, and fundamentally incapable of authentic emotional complexity or intellectual independence. These impossible standards created enormous psychological stress in women attempting to conform to social expectations, while simultaneously managing the genuine challenges of 19th century life without the technological conveniences that would eventually ameliorate some of those challenges. The result was a society in which women experienced high rates of what Victorian medicine categorized as nervous exhaustion, hysteria, melancholic tendencies, and various forms of emotional distress that would be understood in contemporary terms as depression, anxiety, and the psychological effects of living under conditions of extraordinary social restriction and impossible expectations. The pharmaceutical industry, recognizing in this situation an enormous market opportunity, began systematically developing and marketing substances specifically designed to address these conditions of feminine emotional distress. The marketing approach was remarkably sophisticated, employing what would become recognizable as modern advertising techniques, the creation of artificial health anxieties, the development of product brand identities that conveyed status and respectability, the strategic placement of advertisements in publications specifically targeted to women, the cultivation of medical endorsements from prestigious physicians, the development of testimonial networks that created social proof of effectiveness. Hat medicine companies understood that Victorian women were trapped between impossible social expectations and the psychological consequences of those expectations, understood that women had few outlets for genuine emotional expression or authentic human experience, understood that a substance capable of producing euphoria and artificial energy would be extraordinarily appealing to populations living under such constrained conditions. The legal and regulatory environment in which this pharmaceutical marketing occurred was essentially non-existent. The United States in the 19th century had virtually no pharmaceutical regulation. Companies could include whatever substances they wished in their products without any requirement for disclosure, without any requirement for testing of safety or efficacy, without any oversight of marketing claims. Products could be marketed directly to consumers through newspapers and magazines without any regulatory constraint. Products could be sold without prescription through general stores, pharmacies, mail-order catalogs, and direct distribution networks. The pharmaceutical industry operated in what was essentially a regulatory vacuum in which the only constraints on what could be marketed and sold were the practical constraints of what consumers could be convinced to purchase. This regulatory vacuum, combined with the enormous market opportunity created by women's genuine emotional distress, produced the conditions for the creation of one of history's largest pharmaceutical epidemics. The specific substances that emerged as the pharmaceutical industry's primary tools for addressing female emotional distress were those with the most powerful psychoactive properties. Cocaine, morphine, alcohol, chloral hydrate, and various other central nervous system depressants and stimulants were incorporated into medicines marketed specifically for women's nervous conditions. The dosages recommended were often extraordinary by modern standards. Doses of cocaine and morphine that would constitute massive overdoses by contemporary medical understanding were prescribed as routine therapeutic doses. The combinations in which these substances were mixed created pharmacological effects that were unpredictable and often dangerous. The marketing of these substances employed language that was calculated to exploit women's particular anxieties and social pressures. Products were marketed not merely as treatments for specific medical conditions, but as solutions to the fundamental problem of being a woman in Victorian society, as means of achieving the impossible standards of beauty, comportment, energy, and emotional availability that society demanded. The transformation of cocaine from a curiosity of chemical science into a central component of Victorian pharmaceutical culture occurred with remarkable rapidity during the 1880s and 1890s. The process by which cocaine became integrated into mainstream medicine, into commercial products, into household use, reveals the mechanisms through which powerful addictive substances can become normalized within a society when the appropriate conditions of ignorance, profit incentive, and social vulnerability align. The medical establishment, lacking any understanding of addiction as a neurological phenomenon, lacking any mechanism for evaluating the long-term consequences of regular cocaine use, lacking any framework for understanding why patients using cocaine developed patterns of escalating dosages and apparent physical and psychological dependence. Interpreted the obvious signs of cocaine addiction through the lens of underlying medical conditions requiring ongoing treatment rather than through the lens of iatrogenic pharmaceutical dependency. The pattern that emerged was strikingly consistent across multiple medical contexts and multiple populations. Physicians prescribed cocaine-based medications for various conditions. Patients experienced the effects of cocaine, euphoria, energy, appetite suppression, enhanced focus. Patients returned to physicians reporting that their symptoms had improved and requesting continued access to the medications that had produced these improvements. Physicians, observing apparent improvement in their patients' conditions, continued to prescribe the medications. When patients began to require increasing doses to achieve the same effects, a clear sign of tolerance development and advancing addiction, physicians interpreted this escalation not as evidence of drug dependence, but as evidence that the underlying medical condition was becoming more severe and required more intensive pharmaceutical intervention. The circular logic was nearly perfect from the perspective of those participating in it. The more addicted patients became, the more cocaine they needed to consume, the more they suffered from withdrawal symptoms when they tried to reduce their consumption, the more convinced both patients and physicians became that the cocaine-based medications were medically necessary and that discontinuing them would be medically dangerous. The specific populations that became targets for cocaine-based medical marketing were those most vulnerable to both genuine medical and emotional distress, and to the seductive promise of chemical solutions to complex human problems. Women experiencing the effects of social restriction, economic dependence, reproductive challenges, and the psychological consequences of limited life options represented an enormous and largely untapped market for pharmaceutical products. Working-class women struggling with the physical and emotional demands of industrial labor, agricultural labor, and domestic work were particularly vulnerable to marketing that promised to enhance their capacity to meet impossible demands. Wealthy women attempting to maintain the appearance of effortless elegance while managing complex social and domestic obligations found in cocaine-based medicines, a solution to the paradox of needing to appear relaxed while maintaining the constant vigilance required for social performance. The specific marketing strategies employed by pharmaceutical companies during this period reveal a level of sophistication in exploiting human vulnerability that remains troubling even in retrospect. The first critical strategy involved the reframing of normal human emotional responses as medical pathology requiring pharmaceutical intervention. Grief following loss was reconceptualized as pathological melancholy. Anxiety about social performance was redefined as nervous exhaustion. The normal fatigue resulting from excessive work was classified as constitutional weakness. The emotional and physical stress resulting from living under conditions of social restriction and impossible expectations was medicalized as hysteria or some other female nervous disorder. By transforming normal human experiences into medical conditions, pharmaceutical companies created the theoretical justification for treating those experiences with pharmaceutical interventions. The second critical marketing strategy involved the cultivation of testimonials and social proof that created the appearance of widespread satisfaction with specific products. Pharmaceutical companies actively recruited women to provide written testimonials about the transformative effects of their products, testimonials that were published in magazines, newspapers, and product advertising. These testimonials created a feedback loop in which women considering the use of patent medicines would encounter numerous accounts from other women describing remarkable improvements in their health, mood, energy, and general well-being following use of specific products. The testimonials created social pressure, the sense that using particular products was normal, that other women like oneself were using them, that failure to use them represented a failure to take proper care of one's health. The testimonials also created a kind of psychological suggestion effect in which women reading accounts of improvement expected and therefore experienced improvement when they used the products themselves. The third critical marketing strategy involved the strategic placement of advertisements in publications specifically targeted to women and the cultivation of relationships with publications that depended on pharmaceutical advertising revenue. The major women's magazines of the 19th century, Harper's Bazaar, Peterson's Magazine, Godey's Lady's Book, Good Housekeeping, depended almost entirely on pharmaceutical advertising for their financial viability. The revenue generated by patent medicine advertising was so substantial that publications could not afford to alienate their pharmaceutical advertisers by publishing critical information about these products. This created a situation in which the publications most trusted by women for health information were fundamentally dependent on maintaining positive relationships with the pharmaceutical companies whose products they were ostensibly providing objective information about. The advertisements that appeared in these publications were extraordinarily sophisticated in their exploitation of female insecurity and anxiety. The advertisements for patent medicines did not simply claim that the products would treat specific medical conditions. Rather, they created elaborate narratives about feminine inadequacy, about the dangers of not meeting social expectations, about the catastrophic consequences of allowing one's appearance or emotional state or energy level to deteriorate. The advertisements portrayed women using the products as transformed, more beautiful, more energetic, more emotionally stable, more capable of fulfilling their social and domestic obligations. The advertisements created the impression that the choice was not between using a particular product and remaining in one's current state, but rather between using the product and deteriorating into a state of social irrelevance and personal failure. The fourth critical marketing strategy involved the development of product brand identities that conveyed respectability and status. Pharmaceutical companies understood that women would be more likely to use products that conveyed social respectability, and that appeared to be endorsed by medical authority, than products that appeared to be commercial goods marketed for profit. Pharmaceutical companies therefore developed elaborate marketing presentations that emphasized the scientific basis for their products, the medical credentials of the physicians recommending them, the sophisticated chemical processes through which they were manufactured, the natural sources from which their active ingredients were derived. The products were given names that sounded medical and scientific: Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, Professor Williams' female tonic, Dr. Hartman's Peruna, Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. The packaging was designed to resemble medical products rather than commercial goods, with labels that looked like prescription bottles, with language that emphasized therapeutic efficacy rather than consumer satisfaction. The marketing created the impression that these were legitimate medical products that happened to be available without prescription rather than commercial drugs being marketed through non-medical channels. The integration of cocaine into the daily lives of Victorian women occurred through multiple pathways that transformed the consumption of powerful addictive drugs into something that appeared normal, respectable, and medically appropriate. The morning routine of a typical Victorian woman of some means might begin with the consumption of a cocaine-containing tonic marketed as a treatment for nervous exhaustion or melancholic tendencies. The woman would consume what the product label recommended as a therapeutic dose, typically 2 to 4 teaspoons of liquid containing somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 grain of cocaine per fluid ounce. The immediate effects would be noticeable and pleasurable: increased energy, improved focus, enhanced mood, suppressed appetite, a sense of well-being and capability. The woman would interpret these effects as evidence that the medication was working, that her nervous condition was being treated effectively, that she was engaging in appropriate self-care by using the product. The same woman would likely apply facial creams and beauty preparations that contained cocaine, ostensibly to enhance complexion and invigorate skin, but in reality delivering additional doses of cocaine through transdermal absorption. She would apply eye drops containing cocaine that dilated her pupils to create the witty, startled appearance that Victorian aesthetics considered beautiful. She would brush her teeth with toothpaste containing cocaine, marketed as essential for oral health and for the maintenance of moral cleanliness through proper dental care. She would use cleaning products in her household that contained cocaine, ostensibly to enhance their cleaning power, but in reality delivering additional doses of the drug through inhalation and skin absorption during the work of house cleaning. By the time such a woman had completed her morning routine and her household tasks, she might have consumed multiple doses of cocaine through multiple pathways: oral consumption of patent medicines, transdermal absorption through cosmetics, inhalation during house cleaning, absorption through mucous membranes during dental hygiene. The cumulative dose would constitute what would be recognized in contemporary medical contexts as chronic cocaine intoxication. The afternoon routine would likely involve additional doses of pharmaceutical cocaine, perhaps in the form of mood-regulating tonics consumed with afternoon tea, perhaps in the form of energy-enhancing preparations consumed in anticipation of social engagements or household entertaining. Testimonials from women of the period describe feeling remarkably energized, focused, and capable during the afternoon and early evening hours, attributing these states to their own moral character and dedication to proper self-care rather than recognizing them as the predictable effects of cocaine intoxication. The evening routine would involve the application of additional cosmetic preparations containing cocaine and other drugs, preparations marketed as overnight skin treatments that would restore youthful vitality while the woman slept. The woman would consume additional tonics marketed as sleep aids, but often containing chloral hydrate or morphine or alcohol in addition to or instead of cocaine, substances that would produce unconsciousness, and that would contribute to ongoing chemical dependency. The pattern of consumption that emerged was one of chronic polypharmacy, simultaneous use of multiple drugs through multiple pathways, with cumulative doses that far exceeded what any contemporary physician would consider medically appropriate. The substances being consumed included cocaine, morphine, alcohol, chloral hydrate, mercury, arsenic, and various other chemicals of extraordinary toxicity. The combinations in which these substances were used created pharmacological interactions that were completely unpredictable and often dangerous. A woman using a cocaine-containing tonic in the morning, a morphine-containing pain remedy in the afternoon, an alcohol-based nerve tonic in the evening, and a chloral hydrate-containing sleep aid at night would experience neurological and physiological effects that were extraordinarily complex, and that could never have been predicted or understood by any of the medical authorities recommending these preparations. The consequences of this systematic chemical intoxication were profound and multifaceted. Women experienced dramatic fluctuations in energy levels, periods of extraordinary productivity and focus followed by periods of complete exhaustion and inability to function. Women experienced emotional instability, periods of euphoria and confidence alternating with periods of depression and despair. Women experienced cognitive effects including memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and in some cases the development of psychotic symptoms. Women experienced physical effects including rapid heartbeat, tremors, digestive problems, respiratory issues, and the development of various chronic health conditions. Most significantly, women developed physical and psychological dependence on the medications they were consuming, finding that discontinuing the medications produced withdrawal symptoms so severe that they became convinced that the medications were medically necessary, and that returning to the medications was the only solution to the distress they experienced. The documentation of these effects in medical records and in personal correspondence reveals the extent of the suffering that occurred. Physicians' case notes describe women experiencing heart palpitations, trembling, sweating, and anxiety that they or their physicians attributed to their underlying nervous conditions rather than recognizing as the predictable consequences of cocaine use. Women's diaries and personal correspondence describe experiences of mood instability, periods of extreme energy followed by periods of complete inability to function, states of confusion and disorientation that they attributed to the inherent weakness of the female constitution rather than to the chemical substances they were consuming. Medical journals of the period began to document what physicians called an epidemic of feminine nervous disorders, an apparent explosion in the prevalence of various forms of mental and physical illness among women, with physicians entirely failing to recognize that the epidemic was largely iatrogenic, produced by the medical system itself through the distribution of addictive drugs. The family dynamics that emerged in response to widespread female pharmaceutical dependency were extraordinary and troubling. Husbands and male family members often had no understanding of why the women in their lives experienced such dramatic mood swings, such variable energy levels, such unpredictable emotional responses. Some interpreted the instability as evidence of female emotional weakness, as confirmation of the contemporary medical and social views that women were inherently unstable creatures who required male guidance and control. Others became concerned about their wives' or daughters' health and sought additional medical interventions, essentially encouraging the women to escalate their pharmaceutical consumption in response to the problems created by their existing pharmaceutical consumption. The children in these households grew up in environments where maternal mood and energy levels were highly variable, where maternal behavior depended substantially on her pharmaceutical consumption patterns, where the normalization of chemical solutions to emotional and physical challenges was absolute. The most tragic dimension of the Victorian cocaine epidemic was how it affected the capacity of women to develop authentic understanding of themselves and of their own emotional and physical experiences. Women could not distinguish between their own authentic emotional and physical responses and the effects of the drugs they were consuming. They could not recognize that the energy they experienced was chemically induced rather than the result of their own strength or dedication. They could not recognize that the depression they experienced when they tried to reduce their medication was withdrawal-related rather than evidence that they had underlying psychological conditions requiring ongoing chemical treatment. They were systematically denied the possibility of knowing themselves, of understanding their own authentic capacities and limitations, of developing agency over their own bodies and minds. The chemical mediations that were supposed to help them function as proper Victorian women were instead trapping them in a kind of pharmaceutical prison from which escape became psychologically and physiologically impossible. The role of the medical profession in creating, perpetuating, and profiting from the Victorian cocaine epidemic cannot be overstated. The physicians of the 19th century, despite their genuine aspirations to help their patients and to advance medical knowledge, became the primary mechanism through which powerful addictive drugs were distributed to vulnerable populations. The medical education of the era provided virtually no training in addiction, in the long-term consequences of chronic drug use, in the physiological mechanisms through which tolerance and dependence developed. Medical education emphasized the therapeutic applications of newly available chemical substances while remaining entirely silent about the dangers of those substances. Pharmaceutical companies actively engaged in the education of physicians, sponsoring medical conferences and publications, providing free samples of products to physicians, offering financial incentives for physicians who prescribed their products to large numbers of patients. The financial relationships between physicians and pharmaceutical companies were extraordinarily direct and extraordinarily problematic from the perspective of contemporary ethics. Drug companies offered physicians generous discounts on personal purchases of medications, essentially providing free or nearly free supplies for physicians' own use. Drug companies paid physicians substantial fees for providing testimonials about product efficacy, fees that were often equivalent to a significant percentage of a physician's annual income. Drug companies sponsored medical publications and paid physicians to write articles endorsing specific products. The effect was to create a situation in which physicians had direct financial incentives to prescribe pharmaceutical products regardless of whether those products were actually beneficial for their patients. The physician who prescribed cocaine-based medications to large numbers of female patients would benefit personally from the discounts offered by pharmaceutical companies and would receive additional income from serving as a company-sponsored speaker or author. The professional authority and status of physicians created a situation in which their pharmaceutical recommendations were essentially beyond question. When a physician prescribed a cocaine-based tonic for a woman's nervous condition, the woman and her family would accept the prescription as medically appropriate and necessary. The woman would not question whether the medication was actually beneficial or whether it might be causing harm. The woman would accept the physician's interpretation that any adverse effects she experienced were evidence that the medication was necessary rather than evidence that it was harmful. The professional authority of physicians made them extraordinarily powerful actors in the creation and perpetuation of pharmaceutical dependency, power that they exercised in most cases with complete confidence that they were acting in their patients' best interests while actually creating devastating harm. The medical profession's response to accumulating evidence that pharmaceutical dependency was a significant problem was to deny, minimize, or reinterpret the evidence. When physicians observed that patients required escalating doses of medications to achieve the same effects, a clear sign of tolerance development and advancing addiction, they interpreted this observation as evidence that the underlying medical condition was becoming more severe. When physicians observed that patients experienced severe physical and emotional distress when they attempted to discontinue medications, clear evidence of physical withdrawal, they interpreted this as evidence that the medications were medically necessary and that the underlying conditions were indeed serious and required ongoing pharmaceutical management. The professional investment in maintaining the belief that the medications were medically appropriate was extraordinarily strong enough to override the obvious evidence that the medications were causing severe harm. The medical journals of the period reveal the extent to which the medical profession had become convinced of the appropriateness of pharmaceutical approaches to female emotional and physical distress. The American Journal of Medicine, the New York Medical Journal, and other prestigious publications featured articles with titles like "The Therapeutic Application of Cocaine in Nervous Disorders of the Female Constitution" and "Pharmaceutical Solutions to Feminine Hysteria." These articles were written by respected physicians and were published in what were ostensibly the most rigorous and scientifically authoritative publications available. The articles presented cocaine and other addictive drugs as legitimate medical treatments based on genuine observation of therapeutic effects, completely ignoring the mounting evidence that these drugs were causing profound harm. The authority of these publications and the prestige of their authors created a situation in which the pharmaceutical approach to female nervous conditions became integrated into mainstream medical practice throughout the country. The medical establishment's response to the few physicians who began to recognize and attempt to articulate the reality of pharmaceutical dependency was dismissal and professional isolation. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, one of the few prominent female physicians of the era, published observations about the patterns of pharmaceutical dependency she was observing in her practice, observations that challenged the prevailing medical consensus about the safety and efficacy of popular patent medicines. Her work was largely ignored or actively dismissed by her male colleagues who viewed her concerns as emotional overreactions rather than scientific observations. The few physicians who attempted to warn their colleagues about the dangers of pharmaceutical dependency found themselves isolated from mainstream medical practice and professional prestige. The economic dimensions of the medical profession's investment in pharmaceutical solutions cannot be ignored. Physicians benefited financially from prescribing patent medicines through the relationships they maintained with pharmaceutical companies. Physicians also benefited from maintaining ongoing relationships with patients who were dependent on the medications they prescribed. Dependent patients would return repeatedly for prescription refills, for dose adjustments, for management of the various medical and psychiatric problems caused by the medications themselves. A physician whose patient developed cardiac problems from chronic cocaine use could treat those cardiac problems with additional medications. A physician whose patient developed anxiety and depression from cocaine withdrawal when attempting to reduce medication consumption could treat those problems with additional medications. The pharmaceutical dependency that physicians created in their patients generated ongoing business and ongoing income. The hospitals and medical institutions that emerged during this period became centers for the distribution and management of pharmaceutical addiction. Hospital pharmacies maintained elaborate inventories of cocaine-containing preparations, morphine solutions, chloral hydrate compounds, alcohol-based tonics, and various other medications. Hospital physicians prescribed these medications to patients with the same confidence in their therapeutic appropriateness that characterized community practice. Women admitted to hospitals for treatment of nervous disorders would be managed with pharmaceutical protocols that often involved multiple addictive drugs, protocols that would create or exacerbate pharmaceutical dependency rather than treating underlying conditions. The hospital became, in many cases, a kind of institutional enabler of the pharmaceutical addiction that had begun in community medical practice. The emergence of distinct social classes in access to pharmaceutical products revealed the ways that commercial and medical systems organized themselves around profit and social status rather than around genuine health needs. The wealthy could afford expensive patent medicines, could access prestigious physicians who prescribed high-quality pharmaceutical preparations, could maintain consistent access to the medications they had become dependent upon. The middle class could access less expensive but still substantial quantities of patent medicines through general stores and mail-order catalogs, could visit neighborhood physicians who prescribed whatever medications they believed would benefit their patients, could maintain pharmaceutical regimens that, while less expensive than those of the wealthy, were still substantial. The working class and the poor had limited access to patent medicines due to cost, but were not entirely protected from pharmaceutical dependency, because many of the most popular products were extremely inexpensive and were therefore accessible even to those with very limited income. The specific products that emerged as the most popular among different social classes revealed the ways that pharmaceutical marketing was strategized to address the particular circumstances and anxieties of different populations. Wealthy women used expensive, sophisticated preparations marketed as having been developed through advanced scientific research, preparations that emphasized quality and exclusivity, and that conveyed status through their high cost and their association with prestigious physicians. Middle-class women used moderately priced preparations marketed as offering scientific advancement at a price accessible to respectable families. Preparations that were promoted through women's magazines and that conveyed respectability through their emphasis on household management and proper care of one's health. Working-class women used inexpensive preparations marketed as essential for survival in difficult circumstances, preparations that emphasized the capacity to work harder and longer and to bear the physical and emotional demands of their lives. The testimonials that pharmaceutical companies collected and published reveal the ways that different populations experienced their pharmaceutical consumption. Wealthy women in their testimonials spoke about the products helping them maintain their social positions, about feeling beautiful and energetic and capable of managing their complex social obligations. Middle-class women spoke about the products helping them manage their household responsibilities, about feeling organized and productive and capable of handling the demands of their families and their homes. Working-class women spoke about the products helping them survive their work, about being able to work longer hours without exhaustion, about being able to tolerate the physical demands and pain of their labor. All of these testimonials, regardless of social class, revealed genuine subjective experiences of improvement and relief that resulted from the effects of the drugs themselves rather than from any genuine treatment of underlying conditions. The geographic distribution of pharmaceutical dependency in the United States followed patterns of urbanization and accessibility. The major cities of the Northeast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, where pharmaceutical companies had their headquarters and where they made their largest investments in marketing, experienced the most severe epidemics of pharmaceutical dependency. The cities of the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, which were developing rapidly as commercial and industrial centers, experienced substantial epidemics of pharmaceutical dependency following the expansion of pharmaceutical marketing to these regions. Rural areas, where access to patent medicines was more limited, and where traditional healing practices and remedies continued to play more significant roles, experienced lower rates of pharmaceutical dependency, though the condition was not absent even in remote regions because mail-order catalogs and traveling salesmen ensured that pharmaceutical products reached even isolated communities. The integration of pharmaceutical products into different aspects of women's daily lives created multiple pathways for chemical exposure and addiction that made it nearly impossible for women to avoid contact with the drugs even if they had wanted to do so. Women seeking to manage their appearance were exposed to cocaine through cosmetics. Women seeking to manage household tasks were exposed to cocaine through cleaning products. Women seeking to manage their health through ordinary medical care were exposed to cocaine and other drugs through patent medicines. Women seeking relief from pain, from anxiety, from sleep disturbances, from mood problems were exposed to these drugs through pharmaceutical preparations marketed specifically for these conditions. The multiple pathways of exposure meant that even women who might have been skeptical of pharmaceutical solutions to their problems had difficulty avoiding chemical exposure entirely. The social gatherings and social rituals that emerged around pharmaceutical consumption revealed the extent to which drug use had become normalized and integrated into respectable Victorian society. Wealthy women's social gatherings, teas, receptions, charitable organization meetings, often featured what were euphemistically called therapeutic refreshments, beverages and confections that contained various pharmaceutical preparations. The consumption of these refreshments was presented as part of proper social participation rather than as drug use. Women who gathered to discuss their health concerns shared information about pharmaceutical products, compared effects, and offered recommendations to each other. These conversations occurred in social settings that were entirely respectable, that involved no sense of transgression or wrongdoing, that were presented as natural expressions of female concern for health and welfare. The role of women's magazines in normalizing and promoting pharmaceutical consumption cannot be overstated. The major women's publications of the era, Harper's Bazaar, Peterson's Magazine, Godey's Lady's Book, Good Housekeeping, featured not only extensive pharmaceutical advertising but also editorial content about health, beauty, and household management that incorporated pharmaceutical products as essential components of proper feminine practice. Articles about skincare included recommendations for cocaine-containing beauty preparations. Articles about managing household tasks included recommendations for cocaine-containing cleaning products. Articles about managing feminine emotional and physical well-being included recommendations for various pharmaceutical preparations. The editorial content and the advertising content were so thoroughly integrated that readers could not distinguish between objective information and commercial promotion. The magazines essentially functioned as marketing vehicles for pharmaceutical companies while maintaining the appearance of providing objective information and guidance to their readers. The professional networks that emerged among women using pharmaceutical products created informal support systems that actually reinforced and perpetuated pharmaceutical dependency. Women who had become dependent on pharmaceutical products found community and understanding among other women who were similarly dependent. They shared information about which products were most effective, which dosages produced the best results, which combinations of products achieved particular desired effects. They provided each other with emotional support and validation for their pharmaceutical practices. These networks were not organized around the recognition that pharmaceutical dependency was a problem, but rather around the acceptance that pharmaceutical consumption was normal and necessary. The networks actually made it more difficult for women to recognize their pharmaceutical dependency as a problem because they were surrounded by other women who were similarly dependent and who were also normalizing and accepting their dependency. The children of women who were chemically dependent on pharmaceutical products were exposed to the effects of their mother's drug use in multiple ways that shaped their own relationships with pharmaceutical substances and with the concept of chemical solutions to emotional and physical challenges. The behavioral effects of maternal pharmaceutical use were observable to children. Mothers who were energetic and engaged when medicated became different people when withdrawal began, when doses wore off, when access to medications was interrupted. Children learned to recognize their mother's pharmaceutical schedules, understood that maternal mood and energy and capacity to engage with them depended on access to medications, absorbed the fundamental lesson that chemical substances were essential for managing emotional states and meeting social obligations. The physical exposure of children to pharmaceutical substances was also direct and substantial. Children living in households where pharmaceutical products were used extensively were exposed to residual cocaine on surfaces, were exposed to inhalation of vaporized compounds from cleaning products containing cocaine, absorbed small but cumulative quantities of pharmaceutical substances through contact with their mother's cosmetics and preparations. Some children experienced what was euphemistically called helpful energy or unusual concentration, manifestations of contact highs from the cocaine permeating their household environments. The developing brains of children were exposed to these substances during critical periods of neurological development, exposure that had consequences that were never properly recognized or acknowledged by the medical authorities of the time. The socialization of children regarding pharmaceutical solutions to life's challenges occurred through observation and through explicit instruction. Mothers taught daughters how to select, prepare, and consume various pharmaceutical products as part of the normal process of feminine education. Mothers taught their daughters that various forms of emotional distress required pharmaceutical management, that mood problems and anxiety and depression were medical conditions requiring medication rather than normal human experiences requiring psychological processing or environmental change. The lesson that pharmaceutical solutions were appropriate responses to emotional and physical challenges was internalized at a fundamental level, creating a template for how subsequent generations would approach their own health and well-being. The impact on children of having chemically dependent mothers was profound, but was not recognized as such during the Victorian period. Children whose mothers experienced withdrawal symptoms when medication access was interrupted witnessed and were confused by sudden personality changes, sudden emotional volatility, sudden inability to function. Children whose mothers experienced the toxic effects of chronic overdose witnessed confused thinking, emotional instability, behavioral changes that were frightening and disorienting. These experiences were traumatic for children, but were normalized and accepted as inevitable aspects of feminine temperament rather than recognized as manifestations of maternal drug use. The children internalized the message that this was simply how mothers were, that female emotional instability was inevitable, that pharmaceutical dependency was an inherent aspect of femininity itself. The infant mortality and childhood mortality statistics from the 19th century included substantial numbers of deaths that resulted directly from maternal pharmaceutical use. Infants exposed to cocaine through breast milk from mothers who were consuming cocaine-containing medications experienced effects that could be lethal. Infants whose mothers gave them laudanum or other opiate-containing preparations, marketed as soothing syrups for fussy babies, experienced overdoses and fatal reactions. Children grew up in households where younger siblings had died from maternal pharmaceutical use, deaths that were never attributed to the medications, but rather were ascribed to various childhood diseases or to supposed maternal inadequacy. The trauma of these deaths was compounded by the complete absence of recognition that the deaths had been caused by the medical system itself. The psychological and emotional legacies of growing up in households where pharmaceutical dependency was normalized and accepted extended far into the lives of children who grew up in such environments. These children had difficulty developing authentic understanding of their own emotional states because they had grown up observing how emotions could be chemically manipulated. They had difficulty developing authentic relationships because they had learned that emotional connection depended on chemical mediation. They had learned to accept chemical solutions as appropriate responses to emotional and physical challenges. They became the parents of the next generation, transmitting to their own children the same lessons about pharmaceutical solutions, perpetuating patterns of pharmaceutical dependency across generations. The integration of pharmaceutical products into children's healthcare in ways that were separate from the pharmaceutical dependencies of mothers created additional pathways for childhood exposure to dangerous drugs. Patent medicines marketed specifically for children, cough syrups, sleep aids, digestive remedies, often contain the same cocaine, morphine, and other addictive substances that were marketed to adults. The doses recommended for children were sometimes proportionally reduced but often were not, and children's smaller body sizes meant that the drugs had more intense effects on children than on adults. Children were sometimes given these preparations as a matter of routine, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes daily, creating in children the same patterns of pharmaceutical dependency that affected their mothers. The infant mortality and childhood illness statistics from this period included many cases that resulted directly from pharmaceutical poisoning through children's medications. The gender socialization of children was thoroughly shaped by the pharmaceutical culture in which they lived. Daughters learned that female emotional states were inherently problematic and required chemical management. Sons learned that their mothers' and sisters' emotional instability was due to female constitutional weakness rather than to the medications they were consuming. Sons learned that chemical solutions were appropriate for managing life's challenges because they had grown up observing their mother's reliance on pharmaceutical products. The gender lessons transmitted through pharmaceutical culture shaped the assumptions about gender, emotion, mental health, and the appropriateness of pharmaceutical solutions that would characterize subsequent generations. The emergence of organized resistance to pharmaceutical culture from within Victorian society occurred gradually and involved various actors whose motivations and perspectives were sometimes aligned and sometimes in tension with each other. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1873 and led from 1879 by Frances Willard, represented one of the earliest and most influential organizations to recognize and begin to articulate the problems created by pharmaceutical dependency. Willard had initially supported the use of patent medicines as superior alternatives to alcohol, believing that chemical solutions based on science were morally preferable to alcohol-based solutions. But by the mid-1890s, Willard had begun to recognize that the patent medicine industry was creating dependencies as severe and as destructive as alcoholism itself. The transformation of the WCTU from pharmaceutical supporter to pharmaceutical critic was driven by the direct reports of pharmaceutical dependency that Willard began to receive from WCTU members across the country. Women wrote to Willard describing their experiences with pharmaceutical dependency, describing how they had become unable to discontinue medications they had begun taking for legitimate medical reasons, describing how they had attempted to reduce their pharmaceutical consumption and had experienced withdrawal symptoms so severe that they felt forced to return to their medications. These reports revealed patterns that Willard recognized as systematic and deliberate exploitation of women through the pharmaceutical system. The WCTU's response to pharmaceutical dependency was to organize a grassroots campaign of pharmaceutical education and consciousness raising. Local WCTU chapters established what they called women's health circles, gatherings where women could share information about pharmaceutical effects, discuss their experiences with medications, and provide mutual support for women attempting to discontinue pharmaceutical dependency. These circles operated outside of medical authority, creating parallel sources of health information that competed with and contradicted the medical establishment's claims about the safety and efficacy of pharmaceutical products. The women's health circles essentially created an underground pharmaceutical literacy movement in which women were learning to recognize the signs of pharmaceutical dependency, to understand the mechanisms through which they had been chemically manipulated, and to support each other in attempting to escape pharmaceutical dependency. The role of journalism in exposing the pharmaceutical dependency epidemic was crucial and was driven by journalists who recognized that a major public health scandal was being ignored by medical authorities and concealed by pharmaceutical industry marketing. Samuel Hopkins Adams, a journalist with Collier's magazine, published a series titled The Great American Fraud, beginning in 1905, that documented the contents of popular patent medicines, the false claims made in pharmaceutical advertising, and the role of newspapers in promoting pharmaceutical products through advertising revenue. Adams's investigative journalism provided the American public with concrete evidence that they had been systematically deceived about the contents and effects of the pharmaceutical products they were consuming. The role of medical reformers who worked from within the medical establishment was essential for establishing the scientific and medical credibility of the critique of pharmaceutical culture. Physicians like Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, who was one of the first medical graduates of the Paris School of Medicine, and who maintained a prestigious medical practice in New York, began to publish observations in medical journals documenting the patterns of pharmaceutical dependency they were observing in their practices. Jacobi's work was groundbreaking because it came from an unquestionable position of medical authority, and because it provided medical documentation of what had previously been anecdotal observations. Jacobi's work established that pharmaceutical dependency was not a matter of individual weakness or moral failing, but rather was a systematic result of the way the medical system was distributing addictive drugs. The emergence of organized pharmaceutical resistance created conflict between the resistance movement and the pharmaceutical industry that was fierce, and that involved sophisticated propaganda and attempts at discrediting the resistance movement. Pharmaceutical companies launched advertising campaigns that portrayed critics of patent medicines as religious fanatics, as people whose moral agendas were driving them to oppose scientific progress, as enemies of the freedom of Americans to make their own medical decisions. The pharmaceutical industry threatened to withdraw advertising from publications that supported pharmaceutical criticism. The industry pressured medical journals to reject articles critical of patent medicines. The industry sponsored counter-publications that presented alternative information defending the safety and efficacy of pharmaceutical products. Despite the pharmaceutical industry's substantial resources and political influence, the resistance movement gradually built public awareness and political support for pharmaceutical regulation. The evidence that was accumulating, the documented contents of patent medicines, the testimonials from women about their experiences with pharmaceutical dependency, the emerging recognition from medical authorities that pharmaceutical dependency was a significant problem, created a political climate in which pharmaceutical regulation became increasingly difficult to resist. The collision between the pharmaceutical industry's desire to maintain unregulated markets and the emerging public demand for pharmaceutical regulation created the conditions for one of the first major pieces of consumer protection legislation in American history. The role of religious organizations in supporting pharmaceutical reform was significant and provided crucial moral authority to the resistance movement. Religious leaders recognized that pharmaceutical dependency was undermining the moral and spiritual foundations of family life and of Christian community. Religious organizations provided institutional support and resources for the resistance movement. Religious rhetoric about the moral obligations to protect the vulnerable and to resist exploitation provided powerful emotional and ideological frameworks for mobilizing support for pharmaceutical reform. The moral authority of religious institutions made it more difficult for the pharmaceutical industry to dismiss critics as mere commercial competitors or as people with narrow sectoral interests. The emerging understanding of pharmaceutical dependency as a social justice issue rather than merely as a medical or commercial issue was crucial for generating political support for reform. The recognition that women, particularly women without access to powerful institutional advocates, had been systematically targeted for exploitation through the pharmaceutical system, that their vulnerability had been deliberately exploited for profit, that they had been deceived about the contents and effects of the products they were consuming, created moral urgency around pharmaceutical reform. The recognition that children had been exposed to dangerous drugs through children's medicines, that families had been deliberately deceived, that the pharmaceutical industry had prioritized profit over human welfare and human safety, generated political support that transcended the narrow interests of particular industries or professions. The international dimensions of pharmaceutical reform were also significant. Other countries were implementing pharmaceutical regulations earlier than the United States. British and European governments were beginning to recognize that unregulated patent medicine sales represented a public health threat and were implementing regulatory frameworks to control the distribution of dangerous substances. The fact that the United States was lagging behind other developed nations in implementing pharmaceutical regulation became an argument that American reformers used to build political support for reform. The argument that scientific and progressive countries implemented pharmaceutical regulation, while the United States allowed unregulated sales, appealed to American sense of scientific advancement and to competitive nationalism. The political battle over the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was passed in 1906, represented a collision between the pharmaceutical industry's enormous economic power and the emerging political influence of the reform movement. The pharmaceutical companies had spent decades cultivating relationships with politicians, newspaper publishers, and medical authorities. The industry had substantial financial resources to deploy in political advocacy. The industry had control over employment in multiple industries, and therefore had leverage to threaten economic disruption if regulation was implemented. Despite all of these advantages, the industry ultimately failed to prevent the passage of pharmaceutical regulation because the evidence of systematic fraud and harm had become too substantial and too widely known to ignore. The specific provisions of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 represented a compromise between the demands of the reform movement and the resistance of the pharmaceutical industry. The act required that certain substances, including cocaine and morphine, be disclosed on product labels. The act prohibited false claims about the therapeutic properties of products. The act established the Food and Drug Administration with the authority to enforce these requirements. However, the act did not require pharmaceutical companies to prove that their products were safe or effective before bringing them to market. The act did not ban the sale of cocaine or morphine or other dangerous substances, merely requiring that they be disclosed on labels. The compromise that resulted in the Pure Food and Drug Act was substantially weaker than what the reform movement had demanded, but it represented a historic expansion of federal authority to regulate pharmaceutical products. The implementation of the Pure Food and Drug Act revealed both the strengths and limitations of the regulatory approach that emerged from the Victorian pharmaceutical crisis. When pharmaceutical companies were required to disclose the contents of their products, many consumers were shocked to discover that the medications they had been using contained cocaine, morphine, alcohol, and other dangerous substances. When the true contents of popular patent medicines became visible on labels, sales of these products dropped dramatically. Women who had been unaware that they were consuming cocaine daily suddenly recognized that they had been chemically manipulated. The labeling requirement created a moment of truth in which the deception that had been the foundation of the pharmaceutical industry's success was suddenly and undeniably exposed. However, the pharmaceutical industry responded to labeling requirements with reformulation of products to avoid labeling requirements, and with subtle reformulation that maintained psychoactive properties while avoiding disclosure obligations. Products were reformulated to contain substances that did not trigger labeling requirements, but that still produced addictive and psychoactive effects. Products were renamed and repackaged to suggest they were different from previous products, even though their active components were essentially unchanged. Pharmaceutical companies employed chemists to develop compounds that achieved similar effects to cocaine and morphine, but that operated through slightly different neurological mechanisms, and that therefore might not be explicitly prohibited or required to be disclosed. The regulatory approach that relied on labeling and prohibition of specific substances proved inadequate because the pharmaceutical industry had both the technical knowledge and the economic incentive to find ways around the regulations. The limitations of the regulatory framework that emerged from the Victorian pharmaceutical crisis became increasingly apparent as the 20th century progressed. The FDA had limited resources and limited technical expertise to monitor the vast universe of pharmaceutical products that continued to be developed and sold. The pharmaceutical industry had enormous resources to invest in product development and in finding ways to comply with or circumvent regulations. The political influence that the pharmaceutical industry wielded over Congress, over regulatory agencies, and over public policy meant that regulations tended to be weaker than they needed to be and enforcement tended to be less rigorous than necessary. The fundamental problem remained unresolved. The pharmaceutical industry continued to have enormous incentive to market drugs to vulnerable populations and to exaggerate or misrepresent the therapeutic benefits of those drugs. The long-term consequences of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic continued to unfold throughout the 20th century in ways that were never fully acknowledged or addressed. The millions of women who had been subjected to systematic pharmaceutical dependency during the Victorian period carried forward the physical, psychological, and social consequences of that dependency. The generational transmission of lessons learned in pharmaceutical-dependent households meant that children and grandchildren of chemically dependent mothers had often absorbed lessons about the appropriateness of pharmaceutical solutions to emotional and physical challenges. The tolerance for pharmaceutical industry manipulation and for aggressive marketing of drugs to vulnerable populations had been established during the Victorian era and would be replicated again and again throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The medical establishment's failure to fully acknowledge the role of the medical profession itself in creating the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic represented a profound lost opportunity for systemic reform. If the medical establishment had engaged in serious critical reflection about how it had been manipulated by pharmaceutical companies, about how pharmaceutical companies had exploited medical ignorance regarding addiction, about how financial incentives had shaped medical practice, the profession might have developed safeguards to prevent similar abuses in the future. Instead, the medical establishment largely moved forward without fully acknowledging its complicity, without implementing the kinds of systemic reforms that might have prevented similar pharmaceutical epidemics in the future, without establishing the ethical frameworks that might have protected subsequent generations from similar exploitation. The role of racial and class dimensions in the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic was also never adequately acknowledged or addressed. While wealthy white women had primary access to expensive pharmaceutical preparations and to prestigious physicians, working-class women and women of color were subjected to different but equally exploitative pharmaceutical systems. African American women were systematically excluded from access to the most expensive pharmaceutical preparations, but were subjected to inferior and often more dangerous substitutes. The pharmaceutical systems that targeted African American and immigrant populations often involved far more explicitly racist marketing and far more dangerous products than those marketed to white middle-class and wealthy women. The failure to recognize and address these racial and class dimensions of pharmaceutical exploitation meant that subsequent pharmaceutical crises would continue to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable and marginalized populations. The recognition of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic as a historical case study in the failure of regulatory systems to protect vulnerable populations did not emerge until decades after the peak of the epidemic had passed. The historical scholarship that eventually documented the scale of the Victorian pharmaceutical crisis, that collected and preserved the testimonies of those who had been subjected to systematic pharmaceutical manipulation, that analyzed the mechanisms through which an entire generation of women had been chemically addicted, emerged primarily in the late 20th century, more than 80 years after the Pure Food and Drug Act had attempted to address the problem. This lengthy delay in historical reckoning meant that the generation who had directly experienced the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic, the women who had been addicted to cocaine through their medicines, the children who had grown up in households where pharmaceutical dependency was normalized, the physicians who had prescribed these medicines without understanding their addictive properties, largely passed from life without receiving acknowledgement that what had happened to them was not inevitable or unavoidable, but rather was the result of systematic exploitation and deception. The barriers to historical reckoning with the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic were substantial and were rooted in the power relationships that the epidemic itself had created. The pharmaceutical industry had emerged from the Victorian period stronger and more profitable than before regulation had been implemented. The medical establishment, despite some individual physicians recognizing problems with pharmaceutical dependency, largely maintained its commitment to pharmaceutical approaches to health and disease. The cultural assumption that pharmaceutical solutions were appropriate responses to emotional and physical challenges had become so deeply embedded in American consciousness that questioning this assumption seemed almost heretical. The institutions that had benefited from and that continued to benefit from pharmaceutical marketing and the expansion of pharmaceutical use had every incentive to prevent or minimize historical reckoning with how those institutions had exploited vulnerable populations. The recovery of the histories of those who had suffered from Victorian pharmaceutical dependency required deliberate effort to locate and preserve documents, testimonies, and case records that had largely been scattered or discarded. The diaries of women who had experienced pharmaceutical dependency, the case notes of physicians who had documented the effects of these medications, the letters and correspondence between women discussing their pharmaceutical experiences, the pharmaceutical industry's own marketing materials that revealed the deceptive claims being made. These documents had to be systematically collected and preserved to construct the historical record. The oral histories and testimonies of survivors of Victorian pharmaceutical dependency, when they could be located, provided crucial first-hand accounts of what it had been like to be systematically chemically addicted through pharmaceutical products marketed as medicines. The historical scholarship that eventually emerged documented the scale of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic in quantitative terms that were staggering. By conservative estimates, millions of American women had been subjected to chronic pharmaceutical dependency through the consumption of cocaine-containing medicines. The total quantity of cocaine that had been distributed through legitimate pharmaceutical channels during the 19th century vastly exceeded the quantity of cocaine that would be distributed through illicit channels during the 20th century. The number of women whose health had been damaged, whose lives had been disrupted, whose life trajectories had been altered by pharmaceutical dependency was enormous. The economic value of the pharmaceutical products that had been sold, the wealth that had been extracted from vulnerable populations through systematic marketing and sale of addictive drugs, was extraordinary. The recognition of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic as a case study in corporate exploitation and regulatory failure became important for understanding subsequent pharmaceutical crises that emerged during the 20th and 21st centuries. The patterns that characterized the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic: aggressive marketing of products with exaggerated claims about therapeutic benefits, exploitation of genuine human suffering and vulnerability, to sell products that address symptoms rather than causes, financial incentives that encouraged prescription of medications regardless of whether those medications were actually beneficial, the development of pharmaceutical dependency as a profitable market segment. The failure of regulatory systems to effectively constrain harmful marketing practices. These patterns repeated again and again throughout the 20th and 21st centuries with different products and different target populations. The opioid epidemic of the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed the extent to which the pharmaceutical industry had learned the lessons of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and had developed far more sophisticated mechanisms for replicating the patterns of the Victorian era. The marketing of prescription opioids to pain patients, the aggressive promotion of opioids for chronic pain, despite limited evidence for their effectiveness and substantial evidence of their addiction potential, the financial incentives that encouraged physicians to prescribe opioids, the development of extended-release opioid formulations that increased addiction risk, the involvement of pharmaceutical industry in shaping medical education and medical practice guidelines. All of these represented the application of the same exploitation strategies that had characterized the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic, but applied with far greater sophistication and with the benefit of a century of experience in manipulating medical practice and public opinion. The parallels between the Victorian cocaine epidemic and the modern opioid epidemic extended even to the social and demographic dimensions of pharmaceutical exploitation. Just as Victorian cocaine had been distributed differentially based on social class and race, with wealthy white women having primary access to expensive pharmaceutical cocaine, while working-class women and women of color were subjected to inferior and often more dangerous substitutes, the modern opioid epidemic has affected different populations differentially. The opioid epidemic has devastated rural white communities and working-class white communities, creating the appearance of a new public health crisis worthy of urgent attention and sympathy, while opioid addiction among African American and Latino communities, which has persisted at high levels for decades, has been addressed through criminalization rather than through public health approaches. The failure of American society to learn from the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and to prevent the replication of similar patterns in the modern opioid epidemic represents a profound indictment of regulatory systems, of medical institutions, and of the political and cultural forces that have allowed the pharmaceutical industry to maintain its capacity to manipulate medical practice and public opinion. The recognition that the modern opioid epidemic represents in many ways a repetition of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic, that similar mechanisms of exploitation have been successfully deployed again despite the existence of more sophisticated regulatory systems, suggests that the fundamental problem is not merely technical or regulatory, but is rooted in the power relationships that allow pharmaceutical companies to prioritize profit over human welfare and health. The mechanisms through which the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic was perpetuated, despite increasing recognition of the problems it was creating, illuminate fundamental truths about the nature of institutional power and institutional resistance to change. The pharmaceutical industry's primary response to growing evidence that its products were causing harm was not to acknowledge the problems and attempt to address them, but rather to intensify marketing efforts, to increase political influence, to develop more sophisticated public relations strategies, and to invest in research designed to produce evidence supporting the safety and efficacy of its products. The industry's ability to maintain public support despite mounting evidence of harm was remarkable and revealed the power of marketing, of financial incentives, and of the control over medical information to overcome objective evidence of serious problems. The role of financial incentives in maintaining and perpetuating pharmaceutical exploitation cannot be overstated. The pharmaceutical industry was extraordinarily profitable, generating wealth on a scale that allowed companies to invest in marketing, research, public relations, and political influence far exceeding the resources available to those attempting to expose pharmaceutical exploitation. The pharmaceutical companies could afford to pay for testimonials, to sponsor medical conferences, to fund research designed to produce favorable evidence about their products, to employ public relations firms to develop sophisticated propaganda campaigns. The individuals who worked within pharmaceutical companies, the physicians who prescribed pharmaceutical products, the politicians who received campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies, all had financial incentives to maintain and expand pharmaceutical use regardless of whether those uses were actually beneficial. The role of occupational and professional investment in perpetuating pharmaceutical dependency is also essential to understanding how the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic persisted despite recognition of its problems. Physicians had invested their professional identities in the prescription and management of pharmaceutical treatments. Pharmaceutical companies had invested their organizational identities and economic foundations in the development and marketing of pharmaceutical products. Investors in pharmaceutical companies had invested their wealth in anticipation of continued growth and profitability. The medical and business establishments had organized themselves around the assumption that pharmaceutical solutions were appropriate and that the pharmaceutical industry should remain free from substantial regulatory constraint. The disruption of these systems would have required the acknowledgement of fundamental problems and the willingness to undergo potentially devastating institutional reorganization. The role of gender in shaping the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and in determining who was subjected to pharmaceutical exploitation deserves explicit attention. The fact that the primary victims of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic were women was not accidental, but was rooted in the particular social position of women in Victorian society. Women were positioned as emotionally fragile, as inherently unstable, as requiring chemical assistance to function acceptably in society. Women's genuine emotional and physical distress, resulting from living under conditions of extraordinary social restriction and limited opportunity, was medicalized and treated with pharmaceutical interventions that actually created more problems than they solved. The pharmaceutical industry's exploitation of women was successful in part because it aligned with and reinforced existing social assumptions about female inadequacy and female need for male guidance and control. The role of race and class in shaping differential exposure to pharmaceutical products and to the consequences of pharmaceutical dependency was also significant, but was never adequately acknowledged or addressed. The most expensive, most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing was targeted to wealthy white women who could afford the products and who had access to prestigious physicians. Working-class women had more limited access to expensive pharmaceutical preparations, but were subjected to marketing for cheaper, often more dangerous alternatives. African American women and other women of color were largely excluded from access to even the cheaper pharmaceutical products available to white working-class women, and were instead subjected to medical systems that involved different but equally exploitative approaches to pharmaceutical distribution and control. The failure to recognize and address these racial and class dimensions of pharmaceutical exploitation meant that regulatory frameworks developed in response to the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic were often ineffective at protecting the most vulnerable populations. The geographic dimensions of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and the differential impacts on different regions reflect the patterns of commercial expansion and marketing investment. The pharmaceutical epidemic was most severe in the most urbanized regions of the country, where the pharmaceutical industry had invested most heavily in marketing and where products were most readily available. Rural areas experienced lower rates of pharmaceutical dependency, partly because of limited access to products, but also partly because traditional healing practices and self-reliance continued to characterize healthcare approaches in rural communities. The geographic variation in pharmaceutical dependency meant that the political response to the epidemic varied by region, with some regions being more strongly affected by pharmaceutical problems, and therefore generating more political pressure for reform, while other regions were less affected and therefore generated less political urgency for change. The role of international dimensions in shaping the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic is also important. The cocaine that was incorporated into American pharmaceutical products was derived from coca plants grown primarily in South America, particularly in Peru and Bolivia. The morphine that was incorporated into American pharmaceutical products was derived from opium poppies grown primarily in Asia, with significant quantities coming from colonial territories under European control. The dependence of the American pharmaceutical industry on international sources of plant-derived psychoactive substances created supply chains and international relationships that connected the American pharmaceutical industry to colonial systems and to the exploitation of labor in colonized territories. The wealth extracted from vulnerable populations in the United States through the pharmaceutical industry flowed ultimately to colonizers and to their allies in the countries from which the plant-derived drugs originated. The failure of the Victorian era to fully understand or acknowledge the international and colonial dimensions of its own pharmaceutical epidemic limited the possibility of systemic change that would have addressed the root causes of pharmaceutical exploitation. The focus on regulating pharmaceutical products within the United States did nothing to address the colonial systems through which plant-derived drugs were accessed, the systems of labor exploitation in colonized territories that made these drugs available, or the ways that pharmaceutical colonialism created incentives for continued production of potentially dangerous plant-derived drugs. The failure to engage with these international dimensions meant that pharmaceutical exploitation was able to continue through different mechanisms and in different geographic locations, even as regulation began to constrain some aspects of pharmaceutical distribution within the United States. The transformation of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic from an ongoing public health crisis into a historical case study that could be analyzed and learned from required the passage of sufficient time for the events to recede into the past, and for the individuals and institutions directly implicated in the epidemic to lose sufficient power and influence that historical reckoning became possible. The pharmaceutical industry that had emerged strengthened from the Victorian period continued to hold enormous power throughout the 20th century, power that constrained the possibility of historical criticism and analysis. The medical establishment that had been complicit in perpetuating the epidemic maintained its institutional authority in ways that made criticism of its historical role difficult and dangerous for those attempting to mount such criticism. The cultural assumption that pharmaceutical solutions were appropriate and beneficial remained deeply embedded in American consciousness, despite the evidence of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic. The recovery of historical memory about the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic has been crucial for understanding the patterns that continue to characterize pharmaceutical exploitation in contemporary society. The recognition that what happened during the Victorian period was not inevitable, that the epidemic resulted from specific choices made by specific actors, pharmaceutical companies choosing to prioritize profit over safety, physicians choosing to accept pharmaceutical industry claims without adequate critical scrutiny, regulatory systems failing to protect vulnerable populations, creates the possibility that different choices could be made in the future. The recognition that the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic occurred despite its obvious destructiveness, and despite the suffering it caused, reveals the power of entrenched interests and financial incentives to maintain systems of exploitation even in the face of mounting evidence of harm. The stories of individual women who experienced the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic provide particular insight into the human dimensions of systematic pharmaceutical exploitation. The diaries and letters of women describe their experiences of gradual loss of control over their own bodies and minds, of becoming dependent on substances they did not understand, of attempting to escape pharmaceutical dependency and experiencing withdrawal symptoms so severe that they felt forced to return to the medications, of the profound confusion and self-blame that accompanied the realization that the medicines prescribed by physicians and marketed as health products were actually destroying their health. The testimonies of women document not merely the physical effects of pharmaceutical dependency, but the psychological trauma of systematic deception and manipulation. The role of women who recognized the problems created by pharmaceutical dependency and who mobilized to challenge pharmaceutical exploitation represents an important counter-narrative to the dominant institutional history. The women who participated in the Women's Christian Temperance Union's resistance to pharmaceutical dependency, the women who organized women's health circles to share information about pharmaceutical effects, the women who wrote letters and provided testimonies about their experiences with pharmaceutical dependency, the women who supported medical reformers like Dr. Mary Putnam, Jacobi, these women took action despite the enormous power arrayed against them. Their courage in speaking out about their experiences despite the social stigma associated with pharmaceutical dependency, despite the risk of being labeled as hysterical or morally weak, contributed crucially to the eventual recognition of pharmaceutical problems and to the implementation of reforms. The failure of the medical establishment to adequately acknowledge its own role in perpetuating the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and to implement systemic reforms designed to prevent similar epidemics in the future represents a profound lost opportunity. If the medical profession had engaged in serious reflection about how it had been manipulated by pharmaceutical companies, if it had developed mechanisms to resist pharmaceutical industry influence, if it had implemented ethical standards designed to protect vulnerable patients from exploitation, the trajectory of 20th century medicine might have been substantially different. Instead, the medical establishment largely moved forward without such reflection, without such mechanisms, without such standards, creating the conditions for the replication of similar patterns of pharmaceutical exploitation throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The relationship between the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic and subsequent pharmaceutical crises represents a pattern of institutional learning and adaptation by the pharmaceutical industry, rather than a pattern of systemic reform designed to prevent exploitation. The pharmaceutical industry learned from the Victorian period that it needed to maintain the appearance of scientific legitimacy and medical endorsement, even as it engaged in misleading marketing and deceptive practices. The pharmaceutical industry learned that it needed to cultivate relationships with physicians and with medical institutions in ways that created financial and professional incentives for supporting pharmaceutical products. The pharmaceutical industry learned that aggressive marketing could overcome objective evidence of harm, and that the benefits of maintaining or expanding pharmaceutical use could outweigh the costs of addressing problems caused by those drugs. The application of these learned strategies in subsequent periods meant that pharmaceutical exploitation continued and evolved throughout the 20th century. The opioid epidemic that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries demonstrates the extent to which the patterns of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic have been successfully replicated and adapted in contemporary contexts. Pharmaceutical companies marketing prescription opioids employed many of the same strategies that had been employed during the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic: aggressive marketing emphasizing therapeutic benefits while minimizing risks, cultivation of testimonials from satisfied customers, financial incentives encouraging physicians to prescribe the medications, development of modified formulations designed to intensify addiction and to extend the duration of action. Exploitation of genuine human suffering to create demand for pharmaceutical products. The opioid epidemic represents in many ways a repetition of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic at a larger scale and with more sophisticated marketing and lobbying strategies. The lessons that emerge from understanding the history of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic are numerous and are relevant to understanding contemporary pharmaceutical challenges and the ongoing struggle to establish regulatory systems adequate to protecting vulnerable populations from pharmaceutical exploitation. The first and perhaps most obvious lesson is that profit motives and public health concerns are fundamentally incompatible when pharmaceutical companies are organized around the imperative to maximize shareholder returns. When pharmaceutical companies are evaluated on the basis of their profitability, when executive compensation is tied to stock performance, when investment in pharmaceutical companies is predicated on expectations of continued growth and profitability, the companies face structural incentives to continue marketing drugs regardless of whether those drugs are actually beneficial and regardless of what harms those drugs cause. The pharmaceutical industry's behavior during the Victorian period was not aberrational or exceptional, but was exactly what should be expected from commercial enterprises organized around profit maximization. The second crucial lesson is that professional expertise and professional authority do not inherently protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Physicians, despite their genuine commitment to helping their patients and despite their medical training, were systematically manipulated by pharmaceutical companies during the Victorian period, and have continued to be systematically manipulated throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The authority that physicians possess, the trust that patients place in medical professionals, the appearance of objectivity associated with medical judgment, all of these have been exploited by pharmaceutical companies to promote products regardless of whether those products were actually beneficial. The regulation of pharmaceutical practice cannot rely primarily on the professional judgment of physicians, because physicians operate within systems of incentives and influence that pharmaceutical companies have systematically cultivated and have continued to cultivate. The third lesson is that regulatory systems designed to address market failures are necessary, but are perpetually under threat from the industries being regulated, which have both the financial resources and the political influence to weaken regulations, to undermine enforcement, and to create favorable exceptions to rules. The Pure Food and Drug Act, which represented the regulatory response to the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic, was substantially weaker than what the reform movement demanded, and its implementation has been characterized by continuous struggle between regulatory agencies and pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical companies have continuously developed new products and new marketing strategies designed to comply with or circumvent regulations. The regulatory agencies have continuously been underfunded and under-resourced relative to the scope of their responsibilities. The fundamental challenge of pharmaceutical regulation, that the industries being regulated have far greater resources than the agencies regulating them, has never been adequately resolved. The fourth lesson is that the most vulnerable and marginalized populations continue to be the primary targets for pharmaceutical exploitation and continue to bear the greatest burden of harm from pharmaceutical crises. The Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic primarily affected women, particularly women without access to powerful institutional advocates. The modern opioid epidemic has devastated working-class communities and has disproportionately affected rural populations, African American communities, and other marginalized groups. The pattern reflects not accidents of history, but rather reflects the systematic targeting of vulnerable populations for pharmaceutical exploitation, because those populations have fewer resources to resist and fewer institutional advocates to protect their interests. The recognition of this pattern should prompt serious reflection about the ways that contemporary pharmaceutical marketing and distribution systems continue to disproportionately target and harm vulnerable populations. The fifth lesson is that historical memory is crucial for preventing the repetition of past exploitation, and that institutional incentives exist to suppress, minimize, or erase that historical memory. The pharmaceutical industry, the medical establishment, and the regulatory agencies that emerged from the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic all had incentives to minimize acknowledgement of what had happened, to move forward without extensive historical reckoning, to avoid situations in which accountability might have been demanded. The erasure of historical memory about the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic contributed to the creation of conditions under which similar exploitation could be replicated. The recovery of that historical memory has required sustained effort by historians, by advocacy groups, and by survivors determined to ensure that their experiences would not be forgotten and that future generations would learn from past mistakes. The sixth lesson is that the regulation of pharmaceutical industries must be accompanied by more fundamental transformations in how pharmaceutical research and development is organized, and how pharmaceutical products are distributed and marketed. The regulatory approaches that have emerged from recognition of pharmaceutical exploitation have focused on controlling marketing practices, on requiring disclosure of ingredients, on establishing systems for monitoring safety and efficacy. These regulatory approaches are necessary, but are insufficient without more fundamental changes in how the pharmaceutical industry is organized and how it relates to medicine and to society. The fundamental problem is that profit-driven pharmaceutical companies will inevitably find ways to exploit vulnerable populations and to prioritize profit over welfare unless constrained by far more substantial regulatory frameworks or unless organized on fundamentally different principles. The seventh and perhaps most crucial lesson is that the people most directly affected by pharmaceutical exploitation, the women and other vulnerable populations subjected to systematic chemical manipulation, must have central roles in determining policies designed to protect vulnerable populations from pharmaceutical exploitation. The Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic was eventually addressed through the efforts of women who organized to share information about pharmaceutical effects, who documented their experiences with pharmaceutical dependency, who supported medical reformers and policy advocates willing to challenge pharmaceutical industry power. The contributions of these women were crucial and were not adequately acknowledged or valued. The ongoing struggle against pharmaceutical exploitation requires sustained involvement of those most directly affected, those with first-hand knowledge of pharmaceutical effects and of the mechanisms of pharmaceutical exploitation. The recognition of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic as a historical tragedy that resulted from the collision between profit motives, medical ignorance, and social vulnerability should prompt serious reflection about the extent to which similar conditions continue to characterize contemporary pharmaceutical systems. The contemporary pharmaceutical industry continues to exploit vulnerable populations, continues to engage in misleading marketing, continues to profit from creating and maintaining dependency on its products. The contemporary medical establishment continues to be influenced by pharmaceutical industry marketing despite formal disclosure requirements designed to constrain such influence. The contemporary regulatory systems continue to be inadequately resourced and continue to struggle with the challenge of constraining an industry far more powerful and far more sophisticated than the regulatory agencies nominally responsible for oversight. The story of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic is not merely a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale about the ignorance of the past. The story reveals enduring patterns of exploitation, enduring mechanisms through which vulnerable populations are systematically harmed through pharmaceutical systems, enduring failures of institutions charged with protecting public health to adequately fulfill that responsibility. The story suggests that similar pharmaceutical epidemics are not merely possible but are indeed occurring, that the patterns of the Victorian period are being replicated in contemporary contexts with different drugs and different target populations, but with fundamentally similar mechanisms of exploitation. The recognition of these patterns should prompt urgent action to transform pharmaceutical systems in ways that prioritize the health and welfare of vulnerable populations over the profit of pharmaceutical companies. The women of the Victorian era who experienced pharmaceutical dependency, who suffered the consequences of systematic deception and exploitation, who died without receiving acknowledgement that what had happened to them was wrong, deserve historical memory and honor. Their experiences should be recognized not as individual failures or personal weaknesses, but as evidence of systematic exploitation. Their stories should be preserved and should be told to subsequent generations as evidence of the dangers of permitting profit-driven industries to operate without constraint when those industries have the power to harm vulnerable populations. Their resistance to pharmaceutical exploitation, their courage in speaking out despite the social stigma, their organization to help other women escape pharmaceutical dependency, should be recognized as important historical contributions to the ongoing struggle for justice and for the protection of vulnerable populations from exploitation. The concluding observation is that the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic represents a historical example of a preventable tragedy, a tragedy that resulted not from accident or from the inevitable limitations of human knowledge, but from deliberate choices made by people and institutions prioritizing profit over welfare, prioritizing growth over safety, prioritizing power over justice. The recognition of this history should inspire commitment to ensuring that the choices made in the future differ fundamentally from the choices made in the past, that contemporary and future generations will learn from the suffering of the women who were subjected to the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic, that systems will be established and continuously strengthened to protect vulnerable populations from similar exploitation. The story of the Victorian pharmaceutical epidemic is not merely history, it is a call to action.